The resignation letter took me 4 drafts to write. Not because I didn't know what to say, I had known what to say for months, maybe longer, the words stacking up behind my teeth like stones behind a dam. No, the problem was simpler and more embarrassing than that. Every time I started writing, my handwriting changed. The first draft came out small and cramped, the letters pressed together like they were trying to hide from the page. The second was too large, sprawling, defensive. The third had a coffee ring on the corner because my hands were shaking enough to slosh the mug, and I'd crumpled that one without reading it back. The fourth was just right, measured, professional, warm enough that it wouldn't burn any bridges, cool enough that it wouldn't betray anything. Ismail Dudley, Senior Data Analyst, Clearwater Financial Group. Resigning effective 30 days from today. I folded it in thirds, pressed the crease flat with my thumbnail, and slid it into an envelope I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Cream-colored, heavyweight, the kind you used for things that mattered. Then, I sat at my kitchen table for 19 minutes and stared at it. The apartment was quiet in the way that only happens on Sunday evenings, when the week ahead is still hypothetical and you can almost believe you'll handle it differently this time. Outside, someone was walking a dog. I could hear the click of its nails on the sidewalk, the low murmur of its owner talking to it. The same 3 words on a loop, probably. The way people talk to animals when they think no one is listening. The radiator ticked. A door closed somewhere in the building. Ordinary sounds, the kind that make up the texture of a life, and I sat there listening to all of them and trying to feel ready. I had not been in the same room as Marco Glenn in 6 weeks. That wasn't an accident. I'd arranged it carefully with the kind of precision I usually reserved for quarterly projections, taking different staircases, eating lunch at 11:15 instead of noon. Submitting reports through the shared drive instead of stopping by his office the way I used to. 42 floors of glass and steel and open-plan office space, and I had successfully reduced our overlap to 0. It had cost me something. I won't pretend it hadn't, but I'd managed it. And now I was going to walk into the building tomorrow morning, ride the elevator to the 42nd floor, and slide this envelope under the door of the chief analytics officer before he arrived at 8. I wasn't going to see him. I was going to be gone before he ever knew. That was the plan. That was the whole entire plan. The alarm went off at 6. I was already awake. I'd spent the night somewhere between sleep and not sleep. That strange territory where your body rests, but your mind keeps rehearsing things. I rehearsed the walk from the elevator to his office, the length of the hallway, 43 steps, I'd counted. The way the carpet changed color near the executive suites, going from the company's signature charcoal to a warmer gray. As if the closer you got to power, the softer the ground beneath your feet was supposed to feel. I rehearsed the motion of bending down, the slide of the envelope, the straightening up and turning around, and the 43 steps back. Simple. Mechanical. Over in less than 2 minutes. I dressed carefully. Not because it mattered, but because my hands needed something to do. Dark trousers, a white shirt, the gray cardigan I'd had for years that had gone soft at the elbows from wear. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment longer than necessary. My eyes were a little too bright. Everything else was composed. The envelope went into my bag. I locked the apartment behind me. It was early enough that the city was still in that liminal state. Not asleep, not awake, the streets half empty, and the lights still doing something complicated with the clouds. I walked the 6 blocks to the building with my hands in my pockets and my head down, not because I was unhappy exactly, but because I needed to stay inside myself, needed to stay focused, needed not to let any of the ordinary world in, with its coffee-smelling doorways and dog walkers and strangers who looked up and met your eyes like they might have something to say to you. The lobby of Clearwater Financial Group was marble and glass, 70 feet high, with a reception desk that looked like a spacecraft had landed in it. At this hour, it was nearly empty, just the security guard. A man named Philip who had been here since before I started, and who waved at me with the particular warmth of someone who'd watched you come and go enough times that you'd become part of the furniture. Early today, Ismail. Getting a head start, I said, and signed in and went to the elevators. The plan was still intact. Everything was fine. I pressed 42, the doors closed, the elevator began to rise. At the 36th floor, it stopped. I heard him before I saw him. Not his voice, just the presence of him, the particular density the air takes on when someone is about to enter a space and hasn't quite yet. Then the doors opened, and Marco Glenn stepped in, and the whole careful architecture of my morning collapsed. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder tucked under his arm, and he was already looking down at his phone. And for one elastic second, I thought he wasn't going to notice me, that I could just press myself into the back corner, and the doors would close and we'd arrive at 42 in silence, and I could be gone before any of this had to happen. Then he looked up. Marco Glenn had the kind of face that didn't do things halfway. When he was concentrating, the focus was total, laser precise, the kind of attention that could make you feel like the most important thing in the room, even when you suspected you were just a variable in a calculation. When he was confused, it showed in a way that other people's confusion didn't. A small shift in his expression, a fractional tightening, as if the data hadn't matched the model and he was rerunning the numbers. When he was surprised, which was rare, it looked almost like wonder. He was surprised now. Ismael. My name in his voice. That was always the part I'd never figured out how to prepare for. The specific way he said it, like the syllables had weight, like Ismael was 3 small stones he was setting down carefully on a table. Marco. My voice came out even, which was a small miracle. Good morning! A pause. The elevator hummed upward. The floors ticked past on the little display above the doors. 37, 38. You're in early, he said finally. So are you. I had a call with the Singapore office. He shifted the coffee cup slightly, resettled the folder. I didn't know you were coming in today. It's a work day. He stopped. Started again. I haven't seen you in a while. 39, 40. I've been busy, I said. The lie was gentle and we both knew it and neither of us said so. There were things Marco Glenn was, and there were things he wasn't, and one of the things he was, infuriatingly, consistently, was perceptive. He noticed things. He had always noticed things. It was one of the reasons I'd worked for him for 3 years and one of the reasons I was leaving. 41. The elevator slowed. My bag was on my shoulder and the envelope was inside it, and in approximately 40 seconds, this would all be over and I would never have to do this again. 42. The doors began to open. I took a breath, readied myself to step forward, and Marco Glenn reached out and pressed the door close button. The doors sealed shut with a soft, decisive sound. For a moment, I just stared at his hand on the panel. His long fingers, the faint scar on the back of his right hand, from something he'd once mentioned briefly and never explained further. Then I looked at his face. His expression was unreadable in the way it only got when he was very certain about something. "What are you doing?" I asked, stopping the elevator. I noticed that. I meant why. Because, Marco said slowly, setting the coffee cups down on the small ledge built into the elevator wall, a detail I'd never noticed before, a tiny shelf. As if this had been built for exactly this kind of hostage situation. You look like you're about to do something irreversible, and I'd like to have this conversation before you do. My heart was doing something complicated. I kept my expression neutral by sheer effort of will. There's nothing to have a conversation about. You've been avoiding me for 6 weeks. I've been busy. Ismael. He said it again, that particular weight, and I had to actively look away from him. The elevator walls were mirrored on 2 sides, and I could see both of us from the corner of my eye, him standing very still, watching me, and me staring at a point somewhere past his left shoulder, like it contained the answer to a question I hadn't asked yet. You can't hold the elevator indefinitely, I said. Someone will call for it. The building is mostly empty at this hour. We have time. Marco, is it the Heathfield account? His voice changed slightly, not softening exactly, but becoming more careful, the way it did when he was trying to approach something from an angle that wouldn't cause damage. Because I know the way it played out wasn't fair to you. You did most of the foundational work and the presentation credit went to Brennan, and I should have pushed back on that harder than I did. If that's what this is about, it's not about the Heathfield account. Then what is it about? There was a long silence. The elevator hummed faintly. The little display above the doors held steady at 42. Nothing, I said. I'm fine. Can you please press the button so we can? You're not fine. He wasn't accusing me of anything. He was just saying it plainly, the way he stated facts in meetings. Without apology, without drama, like acknowledging a truth, was the simplest thing in the world. You've been not fine for months. I've been watching it and waiting, and I kept telling myself you'd come to me when you were ready. And then 6 weeks ago, you disappeared and I thought I'd done something. My throat did something it wasn't supposed to do. I swallowed it down. You didn't do anything. Then what happened? Because one day He stopped, restarted. One day things were the way they always were between us, and then the next day they weren't, and I don't know what changed. What changed? What changed was a Wednesday evening in the office kitchen, working late, both of us tired in that loose, easy way that happens after a long project is finally finished. What changed was the way he'd leaned against the counter and laughed at something I said. Really laughed. Not the polished professional version, but the actual one. The one that went all the way up to his eyes and made the lines at their corners deepen. What changed was the way I'd looked at him in that moment and understood with the clarity of something I should have known for a long time. That what I felt for Marco Glenn had nothing to do with working for him and everything to do with wanting to know him the way you knew someone you had chosen. What changed was that I'd gone home that night and sat in my kitchen, the same table, and made myself look at the situation honestly. I was an omega. He was an alpha. I was his employee and he was my superior, and I had developed feelings so substantial and so specific that they had their own gravity, and the only way to keep from falling into them entirely was to leave. Nothing changed, I said, the single lie I'd told him that actually cost me something. Marco was quiet for a moment. He looked at my bag. He looked at my face. He had, in his years as the CAO of a mid-sized financial firm, developed an ability to read situations that I had always privately found slightly unnerving. "What's in the bag?" he asked. "My things." "What kind of things?" I didn't answer. He looked at my face again, and something in his expression shifted. That small recalibration, the model running the numbers. "Are you resigning?" he asked. The word landed between us like something dropped from a height. "Marco? Ismael, are you resigning?" I could lie. I was good at lying when I needed to be. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that required you to spin elaborate fictions, but the small, practical kind that kept the peace and kept the distance and kept people from knowing things about you that you weren't ready for them to know. I could tell him no and press the button myself and be out of this elevator in 15 seconds. I looked at him. He looked at me. "Yes," I said. The silence that followed was its own kind of room. Marco didn't move. His hands were at his sides, the folder still under his arm, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Not the confusion I'd expected, not the professional concern I'd braced for. But something else underneath both of those things, something that had a quality I was afraid to name. "Since when?" he asked finally. "I've been thinking about it for a while." "When were you going to tell me?" "The letter is addressed to HR. And to you. I was going to leave it on your desk before you came in. So you were going to disappear," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was more like reading something aloud that had been written in invisible ink. You were going to leave the letter and be gone before I knew. That's generally how resignation letters work. Not when. He stopped, pressed his lips together. He almost never did that, almost never held words back, because he was the kind of person who moved through the world leading with directness. When he stopped himself, it was because he'd thought better of what he was about to say. That was rare enough that I noticed it. "Not when what?" I asked, despite myself. He looked at me steadily. "Not when I need to understand why. The letter explains my reasons. I'm looking for new opportunities. I think it's time for a change." That's what the letter says. Yes. Is that what's true? The elevator hummed. I thought about the 43 steps to his office. I thought about the morning I'd planned. Clean, quick, no wreckage. I thought about 6 weeks of different staircases and 11:15 lunches, and the way my chest had ached like something bruised every time I passed his empty office on a day he was traveling. Marco, I said carefully, I appreciate you caring. I do. But this is a professional decision and I'd appreciate it if you'd respect. I'm not asking as your boss. The words dropped into the air between us and stayed there. I went very still. He held my gaze, and there was something deliberate in it now, something that had shed the professional register entirely. He was looking at me, the way people looked at things they were afraid of losing, with a concentration that was too focused to be casual, too intent to be nothing. Then, what are you asking as? My voice was quieter than I'd meant it to be. Someone who has spent 6 weeks trying to figure out what he did wrong, Marco said, and coming up empty every time. And thinking that maybe, the reason he can't figure out what he did wrong is that he didn't do anything wrong, and that the thing that's actually happening is something else entirely. My heart was not behaving. I pressed my back very slightly against the wall of the elevator, needing the solidity of something. I don't know what you mean, I said. I think you do. There's a thing that happens in high-stakes moments. I'd read about it once, in some article about decision-making under pressure, where the brain's capacity for self-deception sharply decreases. When the adrenaline is high enough and the stakes are real enough, people become truthful almost involuntarily, because the energy required for the performance of untruth is suddenly more than they have. I was starting to feel that. Marco. I heard myself say his name, and it came out differently this time. Not the clipped professional version, not the careful distance, but something more fundamental. What do you want from this conversation? I want to know the real reason you're leaving. And if I don't want to tell you, then I'll tell you what I think the real reason is, he said, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. I should have said, tell me then, should have called his bluff, except I didn't think it was a bluff. Marco Glenn didn't bluff. He made calculated bets based on evidence, and he only made them when he was confident in the odds. Fine, I said, because what else was left? Go ahead. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not uncertainty, but something more like the gathering of something he'd been holding for a while, pulling it up from where he'd kept it carefully stored. I think, he said quietly, that you figured something out about the way you feel, and it scared you, and you decided that the cleanest solution was to remove yourself from the situation before anything could happen. And I think the reason you were going to disappear without talking to me is because you were afraid of what I'd say if you did. The elevator was very quiet. And what would you say? I asked. That I've been trying to have this exact conversation for 4 months, Marco said, and every time I thought I'd found the right opening, something closed it. A deadline, a meeting, you walking away before I got the words out? 4 months. 4 months before my 6 weeks of deliberate distance, before the kitchen, before the laugh. You've been trying to... I stopped. Say it clearly. Whatever it is you're saying, just say it. Marco Glenn set his folder down on top of the coffee cups. He turned to face me fully, which, in the enclosed space of an elevator, meant he was closer than the professional threshold we'd always carefully maintained, and I was aware of the warmth of him. The specific quiet steadiness that had always been his most unnerving quality. I'm saying, he said, that somewhere in the last 3 years, while we were building models and arguing about methodologies and getting through a lot of very long nights with a lot of bad vending machine coffee, I fell in love with you, Ismail, and I have been spectacularly bad at doing anything about it, and if you walk out of this building and out of my professional life over it, I will never forgive myself for waiting as long as I did. The silence that came after that was different from all the previous ones. I was aware of my own heartbeat. I was aware of the 42 floors beneath us. I was aware of the exact distance between his face and mine, not as a measurement, but as a presence, a fact about the world that seemed suddenly more important than most other facts. You're my boss, I said finally, It came out breathless. I hated that. I know. That's a significant. I know that too. Marco, Ismail. Once more, with the weight, with the 3 stones. I know every single complicating factor. I've made a list. It's a long list and some of the items are serious. I'm not dismissing any of them. But you were about to leave, and I had approximately 40 floors of elevator ride to say this before I lost the chance, and so I said it because some things are more important than the list. Looked at him. I had been looking at him for 3 years in the unremarkable daily way that you look at people you work with, processing expressions, reading moods, tracking the small signals that tell you whether a meeting was about to go sideways. And then in a different way, a way I'd mostly been keeping in a sealed room at the back of my mind, labeled something like, not useful, do not open. The door to that room had been taken off its hinges. I was leaving, I said. My voice had gone somewhere strange, not flat, not emotional exactly, but very careful, like I was moving through something fragile. That was the plan. That was the whole point. Leave before anything happened. Something already happened, he said simply. At least on my end. Did it? Was I wrong about your end? I closed my eyes. Opened them. He was still there, looking at me with that particular directness of his, not pushing, not demanding, just present. Just making himself available to the truth, whatever it turned out to be. No, I said. You weren't wrong. The elevator remained stopped at 42. I was aware, in some distant practical corner of my brain, that someone might need it eventually. That we were 2 grown men standing in a stationary elevator in an office building at 7:30 in the morning, having a conversation that had dismantled approximately 8 months of careful management. But that corner of my brain was outvoted by every other part. You've been avoiding me, Marco said. Not accusatory, observational, like he was building a picture from the pieces. Yes. Because you were afraid if you didn't. Because I couldn't. I stopped. Tried again. It was easier, I thought, to have a plan, to make it clean. By resigning without telling me, by making a decision based on what made sense, not on what the word I didn't say sat in the air between us. Wanted. Not one of the words I gave out easily, and he seemed to understand that because he didn't push it. And the envelope's still in your bag? Marco said. It is. What happens to it now? That was the question, wasn't it? The $30,000 question, the one that had the long list attached to it, the complicating factors, the HR manual section on interhierarchical relationships, the entire social architecture of the company that would have opinions about this, the practical realities that didn't disappear just because 2 people had been honest in an elevator. I don't know, I said. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Marco said carefully, that you don't have to decide anything right now. I'm not asking you to unresign, or to stay, or to... I'm not making demands. I just needed you to know before you left. That's all. The rest of it is yours to decide. I looked at him. The warmth of the elevator, the morning quiet of the building, the way his face looked when he was being careful, not guarded, but careful. The way you were careful with things you didn't want to damage. That's very generous of you, I said dryly, and heard my own voice shift, some of the tension bleeding out into something closer to my actual register. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. I've been practicing. Have you? I've had 4 months of failed attempts. You get better at the delivery, eventually. All those failed attempts and you landed on blocking the elevator. You were about to leave, he said, and the almost smile was there fully now, brief and real, desperate times. Despite everything, despite the envelope in my bag, the resignation letter in crisp thirds, the 6 weeks in the careful plan in the kitchen and all of it, I felt something unknot somewhere in my sternum. Not resolution, not an answer, but something looser than the tightness that had been there since the Wednesday night when I'd gone home and made myself understand what I was feeling. You should let the elevator go, I said. People will need it. Yes, he reached out and pressed the button. The doors opened. 42nd floor, executive suites, the warmer gray carpet. Are you coming in? I stood in the elevator doorway for a moment, caught between the 42 floors of down and the 43 steps of straight ahead. I have work to do, I said. So do I. I stepped out. We did not talk about it again that morning. This was, I thought, probably the appropriate thing. The building filled up around us, people arriving in their usual rhythms. The offices coming alive with the sounds of laptops and phone calls, and the coffee machine in the kitchen running at a near constant clip. I sat at my desk and did what I always did. I worked. My hands remembered how to do it even when my brain was partly elsewhere, running and rerunning the conversation in the elevator, turning it over to see if it looked the same from different angles. It did. It looked the same from every angle. He'd said he loved me. Marco Glenn, who I had spent 3 years watching navigate a company with the kind of quiet authority that never needed to announce itself, who had given me more professional room to grow than any supervisor I'd had before him, who laughed in the office kitchen like no one was watching and made the lines deepen at the corners of his eyes. He had said he was in love with me. In an elevator. While holding 2 cups of coffee and a folder. I kept the envelope in my bag. At 11:15 I went to the kitchen because the timing of my lunches had been a piece of avoidance architecture and I was done building that now. The kitchen was busy. 3 people from the risk assessment team, someone from compliance eating at the counter, the junior analysts from the 3rd row who were always there. I poured coffee and stood by the window with it and looked out at the city doing its mid-morning thing. At 11:32, Marco came in. He was in the middle of a conversation with someone from the Singapore liaison team, a video call by the look of his earpiece, and he was nodding at something being said to him. His eyes scanning the room in the automatic way of someone who's learned to track their surroundings without interrupting the current task. His eyes found me, stopped for a fraction of a second, kept moving. He poured a coffee. He went back to his office. That fraction of a second had contained something that I could not precisely name, but that landed in my chest like a small, warm weight. I thought about the list of complicating factors. I made myself go through it the way you went through the risk column of a model, without flinching, without skipping the ugly items. The professional dimension, real, significant, not nothing. The power differential, smaller than it appeared, because I was a senior analyst with 5 years in the industry and would have no trouble landing elsewhere, but still real, still a thing that required acknowledgement. The logistics, also real. The company's policy on intra-organizational relationships was not prohibitive, but it required disclosure and potential reassignment, which would have its own set of complications. The list was, as he'd said, long, and then I thought about 4 months of failed attempts. About the way he'd said desperate times, about the fact that he had apparently been carrying this thing for longer than I had, or at least had been aware of it longer and had been looking for a way to say it. And what that meant. Not that everything was simple, but that it was real, that it had the weight of something real. I went back to my desk. I opened my laptop. I started a new document. It was not a resignation letter. By 4 in the afternoon, I had drafted something that resembled a proposal. Not a romantic one, something more practical, more in the shape of the kind of thing I'd learned to write working for a man who thought in structured arguments. Problem statement. The current situation, as it stands, is untenable in both directions. Continuing as is means sustained professional and personal tension. Resignation, as planned, means an unresolved situation with lasting implications for both parties. Proposed solution: a 60-day transition period in which I would report to a different direct supervisor while we determined whether the personal dimension had the stability to be worth the practical complications. I read it back. It was very clinical. It was also, in its own way, the most honest thing I'd written since the first draft of the resignation letter where my handwriting went small. I thought about going to his office. Then I thought about the way he'd looked at me in the elevator, the patience in it, the lack of pressure, and I opened an email instead. I didn't send it yet. I saved it to drafts. Then I gathered my things and took the elevator to the lobby and went home. The night was clear, one of those evenings where the city felt almost architectural in its precision. every building outlined sharply against a sky that hadn't quite given up the last of the light. I walked the 6 blocks home without my hands in my pockets because I didn't need to protect anything tonight. Or I did, but it was different now. The thing I was protecting wasn't myself from a feeling, but the feeling itself, which was more fragile and more worth protecting. I cooked dinner. I ate it slowly. I did the dishes. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the draft email open on my laptop, and I read it again and thought, this is not quite right. Not because it was wrong exactly, but because I had written it in the register of a professional memo and what I actually wanted to say was something else. I deleted it. Started over. This one was shorter. 4 sentences. It said, I didn't send the resignation. I've been sitting with everything you said. I don't know what the shape of this looks like yet, but I'd like to figure it out, if you would. And I'd like to do it without either of us having to resign from anything in the meantime. I read it 3 times. I sent it. Then I put my laptop away, finished my tea, and went to bed. This time, I slept. At 7:12 the next morning, my phone showed a notification. He'd replied at 11:47 the previous night, which meant he'd still been awake or had woken up to check his email. And I tried not to assign too much significance to either of those options and immediately assigned significance to both of them. The email said, I would like nothing more. Tell me when you're ready to talk. Not at work. Somewhere that isn't 42 floors in the air and ticking upward toward a deadline. Somewhere we have actual time. If you're free this weekend, I know a place. I read it sitting on the edge of my bed, still in the clothes I'd slept in, my hair probably doing something unflattering. The morning light was doing its early thing, gray and tentative, still making up its mind. I was smiling. I noticed it the way you notice something small and unexpected, like the first warm day of a cold spring. It felt like being allowed something. I replied, Saturday works. Tell me where. He sent an address. A coffee place I'd never been to, in a neighborhood I associated with bookshops and unhurried Saturdays and people who brought their dogs inside. I got up and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window and let myself feel what I was feeling, which was something I hadn't given myself permission to do in 8 months. It was large and a little terrifying, and also quietly, stubbornly glad. The week between was its own thing. We were professional, we were careful. We passed each other in the hallway and exchanged the ordinary small talk of colleagues who shared a floor and a project load, and underneath all of that, very quiet, very present, was the knowledge of the emails. The elevator. The things that had been said and received and not taken back. On Thursday, he sent a revised version of the methodology paper we'd been co-authoring for the industry journal, and his comments in the margin were their usual mix of incisive and occasionally wry. And I sat at my desk reading them and felt something that was specifically happiness at the specificity of him, at knowing that the voice in the margin comments was the same voice that had said desperate times in a stopped elevator, that these things existed in the same person, that the same person had said he was in love with me. On Friday afternoon, he knocked on the door of the small conference room I was using and leaned in to say that the Singapore team had approved the revised projections, which was good news for a project we'd both put significant work into. He said it in the professional register, brisk and efficient, and then paused just slightly before he turned to go. Saturday, he said. Just the word. Saturday, I agreed. He went back down the hallway. I turned back to my laptop and found that I'd been holding a pen so tightly my knuckles had whitened slightly, which seemed like an overreaction to a one-word exchange, but was also, I thought, probably the most honest thing my body had done in months. The coffee place was exactly what the address had suggested. Small, warm. The kind of place that had clearly been there for a long time and had no interest in changing, with mismatched chairs and walls lined with bookshelves that had actual books on them rather than the decorative kind. There was a dog asleep under one of the tables. The light came in at an angle through the front window and made everything look like the good part of an afternoon, even at 10 in the morning. Marco was already there when I arrived. He'd found a table near the back, not quite a corner but almost, with enough ambient noise that we'd have the specific privacy of being surrounded by people who had no interest in them. He was in a jacket I hadn't seen before, dark green, the kind of thing that existed outside the office register and made him look like a different and more complete version of himself. He was reading something on his phone, but he looked up when I came in. Looked up before I was close enough that he should have noticed me from the periphery, which meant he'd been watching the door. I sat down across from him. The table was small. Our knees almost touched. "Hi," he said. "Hi." "A beat," I ordered, he said. "I didn't know what you'd want, so I got an extra Americano because that's what you have in the office, but if you want something else." "Americano is fine." Another beat. Then, because we were not in the elevator now, and there was no door close button, and the exit was behind me and entirely accessible, and because I had chosen to come here and sit down, I said, "You seem nervous." He blinked, something rearranged in his expression. You're explaining the coffee order. You never explain logistics unless you're filling silence, and you've looked at the door twice since I sat down." Marco Glenn looked at me for a moment. Then he laughed. The actual one, the full one, the one that went to his eyes. "I've been preparing for this conversation for 4 months, he said, and I've had a week to prepare for the specific version of it, and I'm still nervous, yes. Thank you for making it explicit. I find explicit preferable. I know, it's one of the things He stopped, reconsidered his approach. "It's something I've always appreciated about you." The coffee arrived. We both wrapped our hands around our cups, and the small ritual of it seemed to ease something, gave the next few seconds somewhere to go. "I want to start with the practical things," I said, "because if we don't, they'll sit in the background the whole time and I'll be half somewhere else." "Go ahead." The company policy on relationships between employees at different hierarchical levels requires disclosure within 30 days of the commencement of the relationship and allows for voluntary reassignment to address reporting conflicts. I've read it. It's not punitive. It requires paperwork and probably a conversation with HR, and there would need to be a point where I report to a different supervisor. "I know. I've read it too. Recently, or 3 months ago." A pause. I said I'd been trying to find the right opening. I didn't say I hadn't been planning. I thought about that for a moment. About him reading the company policy 3 months ago, which was before my 6 weeks of deliberate distance, which was before the kitchen, which meant he'd been sitting with this even longer than I'd understood. "And the rest of it?" I asked. "The rest of it, the power dimension, the history of working together, the adjustment period that would be required." "Real," he said simply. "All real. None of it insurmountable in my view, but I'm aware that's my view, and you're entitled to a different assessment." He met my eyes. "What's your assessment?" I thought about it. Not the way I'd been thinking about it all week, the constant low-level hum of it in the background, but directly, looking at him across a small table with mismatched chairs and a dog sleeping somewhere nearby. "I think," I said slowly, "that I spent several months treating what I felt as a problem to be managed, and that the management strategy was removing myself from the situation, which is a reasonable strategy when the situation doesn't have any other resolution. But I think I may have concluded that there was no other resolution before I'd fully tested that assumption." Marco was listening to me with the focus he brought to things he considered important, not just waiting for me to finish, but actually in it, tracking every word. "And now," he said, "and now I'm testing the assumption. What does the test look like?" "It looks like this." I gestured slightly at the table, the coffee, the space between us. "And then more of this, if it goes well. And then eventually something that requires a form filed with HR and probably some uncomfortable questions from the team because people will notice." "People have already noticed something," Marco said wryly. "Your 6 weeks of different staircases were less subtle than you may have intended." I felt my face do something involuntarily, a small wince, a flash of something embarrassed. "How bad?" I've heard the phrase, "something going on between Dudley and Glenn," more than once. I may have handled my side of it poorly. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said with the particular look of someone acknowledging something slightly uncomfortable, "that on at least 2 occasions when someone asked if you were all right, I was curt in a way that probably told them more than nothing would have. I stared at him. Marco. I know. You were. I was concerned, and not managing it particularly gracefully. I'm aware. I picked up my coffee. Put it down. I thought I was the one handling this badly. I think, Marco said, we were both handling it badly. In different directions, maybe. But both of us. Something settled between us with that. A mutual accountability that felt more like solid ground than any of the alternatives. More honest. Less like one person had made a mistake and the other had been fine. Okay, I said. Okay? Okay. We were both handling it badly. That seems like a reasonable starting point. The corner of his mouth moved. Not the most romantic framing. I'll work on the romantic framing later. Right now, I want the honest one. Fair. We sat with the coffee and the morning light and the low sound of the cafe around us, and it wasn't silence exactly. It was more like a pause in which we were both taking in the shape of what had just been acknowledged. That this was real, that we were both choosing it. That the complications were real and we were choosing it anyway. Can I ask you something? I said. Anything. The elevator. When did you decide to? You were already on 36 when you got in. You'd been in the building for a while. What made you press the button? He was quiet for a moment. You had the envelope in your bag, he said. I could see the corner of it. And you were looking at the floors ticking past in the way you look at things when you're timing something, when you're waiting for a specific moment. I've seen you do it in meetings when you're waiting for the right point to make a move. He paused. I thought, if I don't do it now, I never will. And that seemed worse than any of the alternatives. Desperate times, I said. Desperate times. I reached across the table and set my hand on his. Just that. Not dramatically, not as a grand gesture, but as the simplest version of what I wanted to do, which was touch him, which was let him know that what we were doing here was real. His hand turned under mine and held on. The next 3 months were not uncomplicated. I would be dishonest if I said the shape of it was easy, or that the practical architecture assembled itself without friction. There was a meeting with HR, 2 of them actually, because the first one raised a question the second one needed to answer. There was a period of about 3 weeks where I reported to the director of strategic analytics, a woman named Bea who had the brisk efficiency of someone who'd heard everything twice and found almost none of it surprising. She welcomed me with a handshake and a comment that my Q3 projections had been more rigorous than anything that had come out of the team in 2 years. Which was the kind of compliment she probably thought was sufficient and probably was. There were colleagues who made expressions at us in the kitchen. There were colleagues who made no expressions but clearly had feelings. There was one person from legal, a man I had spoken to perhaps 4 times, who made a comment under his breath in the elevator that I chose to let go and that Marco heard and did not choose to let go. And there was a conversation about that afterward in which we disagreed about the correct response to that kind of thing and eventually arrived at a position that acknowledged both of our instincts without fully satisfying either of them. That conversation took an hour and a half and ended with both of us slightly frustrated and then, abruptly, not frustrated, because there is something about 2 people genuinely grappling with a disagreement that is its own form of intimacy. Not comfortable necessarily, but real. The work continued. My work was different now. Different supervisor, different daily rhythms. But the quality of it was unchanged and in some ways better. Because I was no longer spending a portion of my cognitive energy on the management of a feeling. The feeling was just there, acknowledged, factored in, not a drain, but a fact. It changed the texture of the workday in small ways. The ease of passing his office and not having to recalibrate my expression. The ability to reply to his emails in my own voice rather than the careful professional one. The mornings when we arrived at roughly the same time and rode the elevator together without anyone blocking anything. We didn't always get along easily. Marco was. As I'd known in the professional context and as I learned more fully in the personal one. Someone who held his positions firmly, who thought in deep structures and was not easily moved by surface-level argument. who had a habit of being right that he was only partially aware of, and that could be on its bad days genuinely maddening. I was, according to him, meticulous in ways that occasionally shaded into inflexibility, and given to a form of emotional pre-processing that meant I sometimes arrived at conclusions before sharing the reasoning and expected the conclusions to be accepted on their merits. We had that conversation too, not all at once, but in pieces over the course of weeks that became months. The ongoing negotiation of two people who had spent 3 years working together and were now doing the stranger and more requiring work of actually knowing each other. It was, in its way, the best kind of work. On a Friday evening, not the first such Friday, not the last, but one that sat in memory with a particular warmth, we were at my apartment, which had become over the months a place he came to often enough that it had started to carry traces of him. A jacket on the hook by the door, a book on the coffee table that wasn't mine, 2 mugs, not one. We'd ordered dinner, and the containers were still on the kitchen table, and we were both too comfortable to clear them yet. The kind of comfortable that only happens when you've been in the same space often enough that you've synchronized rhythms without trying to. "Can I ask you something?" Marco said. "You can always ask me something." The kitchen. The Wednesday, 6 weeks before I started avoiding you. Yes. He was looking at me with the particular attention he brought to things that mattered. "Was that when you knew?" I thought about it. The way I thought about things, carefully, fully, not looking away. "That was when I let myself know," I said. "I think I'd known for longer." "How much longer?" "A while." A pause. "You?" "Longer than I'd like to admit." He said it simply, without embarrassment. There was a Sunday, about 8 months before everything. We were both in for the quarterly push, and the building was empty, and we were ordering from the same place, and I stayed later than I needed to. I noticed I'd stayed later than I needed to. I filed it and kept going. 8 months before everything. That put his awareness of it well before mine, or before my acknowledgement of mine anyway. He'd been sitting with it for longer. "You filed it," I said. I didn't know what else to do with it. The professional context felt like the responsible thing was to manage it, to keep it in a drawer. That's what I was doing, toward the end. I know. I recognized it when you started. I'd done it too. 2 people keeping the same thing in a drawer, filing it, managing it, mistaking management for absence. "Well," I said, "we're very good at managing risk, professionally speaking. Terrible at it personally, apparently. To be fair, it's a different kind of risk, is it?" I thought about it. "Not really," I admitted. "The basic structure is the same. Something valuable, uncertainty about the outcome, the temptation to not act in order to not lose." I paused. We both opted for not acting for a while. "And then I blocked the elevator." "And then you blocked the elevator." He looked at me with something in his expression that I had learned to read over the months, that particular quality of being both certain and, underneath it, still slightly awed that things had gone the way they had. Like he'd run the probability and the outcome was better than the model predicted. "I was terrified," he said. "In the elevator, in case you're wondering, I was very calm and I was terrified." "You didn't seem terrified." "I know. It's a problem I have." I leaned across the table and took his hand, the same way I'd done the first Saturday, just the simple claiming of the gesture, the choosing of it. His fingers closed around mine. "I was terrified too," I said. "You seemed like you wanted to walk through the elevator wall." "That would have been terrifying for different reasons." I paused. "I'm glad you blocked it. I'm glad you didn't send the resignation." The kitchen was quiet around us. The ordinary sounds of the building, someone walking above, the street outside, the radiator ticking its familiar rhythm. The same sounds as the Sunday night with the envelope and the 19 minutes. But the quality of the quiet was different now. It was full rather than empty. It had something in it. Marco turned my hand over in his and looked at it for a moment the way he sometimes did, with a focused, quiet attention, as if the fact of it was something worth noticing every time. Then he looked up. "You still have the envelope?" he asked. I'd been wondering when he'd ask about that. "Yes." "What are you going to do with it?" I said, that I might keep it in a drawer somewhere, as a reminder. Of what? Of what it looked like when I was trying to manage something instead of just, I considered the right word, being in it. His expression did the thing it did when something landed right. A small movement, almost a smile, but quieter, more internal. That seems like a good thing to have around. I thought so. He brought my hand up and pressed it briefly to his mouth. Not a kiss exactly, something more like an acknowledgement, the way you confirm a fact by touching it. Then he set it back down on the table, still holding on. I should have said something sooner, he said. So should I. We're saying it now. We're saying it now, I agreed. Outside, the city was doing its evening thing. The shift from the working day to the rest of it. Lights coming on in windows. The sound of the street changing its character. The containers were still on the table. The jacket was still on the hook. The book with the bookmark still 3/4 through was still on the coffee table. Everything in its right place. The framed copy of the resignation letter was Bia's idea. She'd made it at our going away party. Going away, in the sense that she was retiring and we were throwing her a celebration that had the warmth and noise of something long deserved. And she'd handed it to me with the look of someone who'd been waiting to deliver this particular punchline for approximately 3 years. The letter, that cream-colored heavyweight paper, now in a thin black frame, the words plainly visible, Ismail Dudley. Senior Data Analyst. Resigning effective 30 days from today. For the wall, she'd said, in the tone that meant she was not kidding. Marco had laughed, the actual laugh. I'd held the frame and looked at it and felt something that was the combination of many things. Amusement and embarrassment, and something more complicated underneath both of those. We hung it in the hallway of the apartment, not prominently. In the space between the kitchen and the living room, at the level where you'd see it if you were paying attention and miss it if you weren't. The kind of thing that was for you, not for anyone else. I'd been promoted twice in those 3 years, which happened not because of Marco. I want to be precise about this because I had been precise about it at the time when it was being considered, and had had the conversation directly with him about what independence meant and why it mattered to me, but because the work merited it. I was deputy director of analytics now, which meant I had my own team and my own floor-level authority and my own seat at the table in the senior meetings. Marco was still CAO. We no longer had a reporting relationship in any configuration. We had colleagues who'd watched the whole arc of it with varying degrees of investment, and we had the reputation, quiet, professional, not the subject of ongoing commentary, of two people who had sorted things out in a way that didn't make anyone else's work harder. We had, as it turned out, sorted things out, not without friction, not without the ongoing work of it, the disagreements that required resolution, the adjustments that required patience, the occasional moment of genuine frustration that required both of us to remember what the alternative had looked like and choose the current situation again, but sort it out. In the way that real things were sorted out, imperfectly, in motion, with the willingness to keep at it. On a Sunday morning in spring, the best kind of Sunday. Slow and light, and with no particular agenda. I was at the kitchen table reading something on my tablet when Marco came in from the bedroom in the unhurried way of someone who had nowhere to be poured coffee, and sat down across from me. He set a small envelope on the table. I looked at it. It was cream-colored, heavyweight. "What is this?" I said. "Open it." It was not a resignation letter. It was. When I unfolded it carefully along crisp new creases, a single sheet of paper with Marco's handwriting on it, which was precise and even and a little old-fashioned in the way of people who'd learned to write before everything went digital. It said, 3 years ago, I blocked an elevator and said a thing I'd been not saying for too long. This is the version of that thing I would have said if I'd had more time and less adrenaline. I love you, Ismail Dudley. I have loved you since a Sunday in Q4, when you stayed later than you needed to, and so did I. And I am profoundly grateful that you did not send that letter and that I was standing on 36 when you came in at 7:30 on what was supposed to be your last morning. If it's of any interest, I'd like to keep going. I. I read it twice. I set it on the table. I looked at him across the morning coffee and the spring light and the ordinary Sunday architecture of a life that had been made piece by piece, out of choices, including one very important choice not to let an elevator door open too early. If it's of any interest, I said. Too subtle? It's adequately direct, I think. High praise. From me, yes. I reached across the table and took his hand. 3 years of this gesture, and it still felt like choosing. I'd like to keep going too. He looked at me with that expression, the certain but odd one, the one that had the probability model in it and the gratitude for the positive residual. Good, he said. Outside, the spring was doing what spring did. The particular warmth of it, the light with a different quality than winter's, the sound of things that had been quiet starting up again. Inside, the coffee was warm and the framed letter was in the hallway, and we were 2 people sitting at a kitchen table on a Sunday with nowhere to be. The envelope stayed on the table all morning, between us. Not in a drawer, not filed away. Just there, available to be seen, a record of something that had been carried quietly and then, finally, said out loud, which is the only way it ever works, in the end. You carry it, and then someone blocks the elevator, or you cross the table with a letter in cream-colored paper, or you reach out your hand and let the other person hold on. And then you keep going. The building is 42 floors of glass and steel, and on the 36th floor, there is an elevator bank with 4 cars, and in one of those cars, the second from the left, if you're counting, there is a small shelf built into the wall beside the button panel. Nobody notices the shelf. It's the kind of thing that was put there in the original construction for purposes nobody quite remembers anymore. Something to do with the original design specification or the architect's idea of gracious detail. Or simple practicality, a place to set something down while you are finding your badge. But the second car on the left knows. The building knows, in the way that buildings know things. Not consciously, not in any useful sense, but in the accumulated texture of all the moments that have passed through them. The weight of 2 coffee cups on a small shelf, the specific pressure of a finger on a door close button, the silence that stretched from floor 36 to floor 42, full of everything that hadn't been said yet. The elevator goes up and down 42 floors, every day. And somewhere near the top 2 people are doing the ongoing work of the thing they chose, in meetings and in kitchens, in agreements and in arguments, in Sunday mornings with cream-colored envelopes, and in ordinary Wednesdays with nothing remarkable about them at all. Building the unremarkable and remarkable shape of a life together, which is how it goes when you stop managing the feeling and just let yourself be in it. Which is how it was always going to go once someone blocked the elevator. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.